Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, and before we even get into the material today, because we have a lot to cover, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the show so you never miss out on these really extensive breakdowns.
Right. You definitely want to subscribe to this one.
Exactly, because we have an incredibly intense, really dense journey ahead of us today. We are unpacking a brand new, highly provocative ebook. It's titled Order and Dominion: Saint Cedd's Mission and the Modern Man's Role in Restoring Divine Hierarchy. And that is by Conrad Riker.
It is quite the title, and it really sets the stage for exactly what's inside.
It really does. Now, if you are listening to this as a man trying to make sense of a world that just feels, frankly, increasingly chaotic, or specifically if you follow the historical capture of our Western institutions by, say, feminist and Marxist ideologies, this book is explicitly positioned as a battle plan for you.
Yeah, a survival guide.
Right, a survival guide for modern men who feel adrift, men who feel disconnected from traditional roles and are looking for some kind of, I don't know, historical and philosophical grounding to reclaim their footing.
And, I mean, it is a massive, expansive text. The author doesn't just stick to modern political commentary. He pulls heavily from theology, from ancient history, quantum physics, and sociology to build this very specific, really uncompromising worldview.
The physics part really threw me, but we will get to that. But because we are going to get incredibly deep into the weeds on those subjects, I want to give you a quick call to action right at the top. If you want to follow along, or if you want to dive into the source material yourself, you should absolutely check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book right now.
Highly recommend having it open if you really want to parse his arguments.
Yeah. You can also follow the author directly. That's at Conrad Riker on Substack, just to keep up with his ongoing essays. Now, before we jump into Chapter 1, we really need to lay down a crucial ground rule for today's deep dive.
Very important.
This book contains highly charged political, social, and cultural arguments. As your guides through this material, we are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing the author's viewpoints.
No, not at all. Our job today is purely journalistic.
Exactly. Purely journalistic. We are here to unpack, analyze, and help you understand the concepts, the histories, and the arguments that are presented in the source material. We are here to report on the text impartially, so you can evaluate all these ideas for yourself.
That is such an essential distinction to make. I mean, our goal is synthesis, comprehension, context. We are analyzing the architecture of Riker's argument, not validating it.
Right. With that established, here's the roadmap for today. We're going to start by exploring what Riker terms the domino effect of societal collapse and his diagnosis of the modern crisis of masculinity.
Which is where he really sets the hook.
Yeah. From there, we'll move into the cosmic syntax of the universe, which is where the book actually uses physics to justify social order. Then we'll open up the historical playbook of cultural Marxism. And finally, we'll break down the actionable blueprint the author provides for men to reclaim their dominion, drawing really heavily on the ancient wisdom of a 7th century missionary named Saint Cedd.
It's a wild journey.
It is. So let's start with the foundation. What exactly is the core crisis of the modern man, according to Riker's opening chapters?
Well, Riker diagnoses the foundational problem by pointing to 3 interconnected forces. He lists cultural Marxism, feminism, and modern gender ideology. And his central thesis is that the mainstreaming of these specific ideologies has systematically dismantled the traditional frameworks of society.
So he's saying this isn't an accident.
Right. He argues it's systematic. According to the text, the direct result is that men are experiencing this profound, really existential sense of disorder. He argues that by stripping men of their historical roles as the undisputed providers, protectors, and leaders, society has basically left them feeling adrift and emasculated.
And I think if you are listening to this, you have probably noticed or personally felt what the book describes as the double bind of modern masculinity.
The double bind is huge.
It's everywhere. The text argues that men are currently trapped in this crazy cultural paradox. On one hand, you're constantly told by media, by modern psychology, that you need to be vulnerable, right? To open up, to shed your stoic exterior. But the book contends that the moment men actually do this, the second they show that vulnerability, they are frequently shamed for weakness or viewed as less competent by the very people who asked for it.
Yes, exactly. And then you have the flip side of that coin. If a man exhibits traditional traits, assertiveness, competitiveness, aggression, he is immediately labeled with the term toxic masculinity.
So you literally can't win.
You can't. Riker views this as a fundamentally rigged game. And his analysis suggests that when winning the game of masculinity becomes culturally impossible, a massive demographic of men simply stop playing.
They just opt out.
They opt out. And this is how he explains the modern man-child phenomenon. Rather than navigate this completely impossible double bind, men disengage. They retreat. They go into video games, endless social media scrolling, porn, and just a general state of apathy.
Which creates a lost generation.
Right, a lost generation of confused men who absolutely refuse to take on the mantle of adulthood or leadership because, well, the societal rewards for doing so have been erased.
But Riker doesn't just view this as a personal tragedy for individual men, right? Like, he scales this up to a macro level, which brings us to his concept of the domino effect. Walk us through how he connects this individual retreat to the collapse of the broader society.
So Riker asserts that traditional gender roles aren't arbitrary social customs that you can just swap out depending on the decade.
Like, it's not just faction.
Exactly, it's not a trend. He views them as the absolute linchpin of a functioning civilization. He describes the nuclear family as a literal microcosm of the universe's natural order, specifically with the father in a strict leadership role and the mother in a nurturing role.
Okay.
So, according to his domino effect theory, when you dismantle that specific, localized dynamic in the home, the first domino falls. Once the family structure is weakened and the father is marginalized, the church or the local community structure falters.
Because the local leadership is gone.
Right, the spiritual hierarchy is broken.
Yeah.
And once the family and the church collapse, the state itself becomes unstable. His core argument is that you cannot construct a strong, cohesive nation built on the foundation of fragmented, fatherless families. It just mathematically doesn't work.
And the book provides some very specific historical warnings to back this theory up, which I found fascinating. For instance, he points to Sweden.
The 2015 example.
Yeah. He highlights that in 2015, Sweden officially introduced gender-neutral pronouns into their national vocabulary. That was a huge state initiative. Riker then cites a 2020 report from the Swedish National Institute of Public Health. Now, according to his reading of the report, children raised in heavily enforced gender-neutral environments are actually 30% more likely to experience confusion about their gender roles.
30% is a massive statistical jump.
It's huge. Furthermore, parents in those specific households reported a massive increase in conflict over parenting styles. And fathers specifically expressed that they felt pushed out of their distinct roles as providers and protectors. Like, they didn't know what their job was anymore.
And he pushes this historical lens much further back to emphasize his point, specifically looking at the Soviet Union in the 1920s.
Right after the revolution.
Exactly. Following the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks actively attempted to completely abolish traditional gender roles. They basically viewed the nuclear family as a capitalist construct.
They thought it was bourgeois.
Yes. So they pushed women into traditionally male-dominated heavy labor and tried to make men and women entirely interchangeable. And this was all in an attempt to manifest a pure egalitarian utopia where gender didn't matter.
And how does the text describe the outcome of that social experiment? Because obviously we know the Soviet Union didn't become a utopia.
Riker describes it as a spectacular failure that resulted in absolute social chaos. According to the history he cites, family cohesion rapidly deteriorated, birth rates plummeted, and the Soviet state was suddenly burdened with this massive crisis of abandoned children and broken homes.
Because nobody was containing the family in it.
Right. The societal damage was so severe and so immediate that by the 1930s, the Soviet government, under Stalin no less, was actually forced to reverse many of these progressive policies. They had to reinstate the importance of motherhood and traditional family structures just to stabilize the nation.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and Riker uses this to argue that biology and natural order will always reassert themselves, often violently, when ideological social engineering fails.
He also references the historian Edward Gibbon and his analysis of the fall of the Roman Empire. The bedrock of Roman society was the familia, right? Led by the paterfamilias, the male head of the household.
The absolute authority in the home.
Right. Riker highlights Gibbon's argument that as Rome succumbed to moral decay, hedonism, and the breakdown of that core patriarchal family structure, the empire just lost its fundamental discipline and strength. The text makes a very direct parallel here, suggesting that the modern West is currently repeating this exact cycle of familial breakdown leading to imperial collapse.
And this naturally transitions into what is probably one of the most unexpected and complex sections of the text. Because Riker doesn't just rely on sociological cycles or Roman history to make his point about hierarchy. He scales his argument all the way up to physics and metaphysics.
This was the pivot that really caught me off guard.
It's a big swing.
It really is. You don't usually see a book about traditional masculinity suddenly dedicate a chapter to cognitive theoretic physics. But Riker anchors his entire worldview in a framework called the CTMU, the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe.
Yes, the CTMU was developed by a thinker named Christopher Langan, who is often cited as having an exceptionally high IQ, like one of the highest recorded. Riker uses Langan's highly complex model to posit that reality itself is a self-configuring, self-processing language. He says it operates on what he calls a cosmic syntax.
Let's pause there, because self-processing language and cosmic syntax, those are incredibly dense terms. If you're listening to this and trying to wrap your head around it, how does Riker actually explain this to a layman?
The easiest way to understand how Riker applies this is through an analogy he provides. Think of the universe not as a box of random floating objects, but as a giant, incredibly complex sentence.
Like a written sentence.
Right. Every word in that sentence only makes sense because of the grammar rules governing it. The noun goes here, the verb goes there. If you remove the grammar, if you remove the structure, the hierarchy, the sentence doesn't become equal. It becomes gibberish. It loses all meaning.
It just falls apart.
Exactly. Riker is arguing that the universe requires this strict grammatical structure to exist at all.
So Riker is asserting that hierarchy isn't a human invention. It's not a tool created by some patriarchal ruling class to oppress marginalized groups. He's saying hierarchy is a fundamental mathematical law of physics.
Yes, woven into reality.
It exists at the subatomic level, where electrons orbit nuclei, all the way up to the galactic level, where solar systems orbit black holes. Everything has a defined place, an order, and a function within the whole.
Exactly, and this is where Riker levels his heaviest philosophical critique against cultural Marxism. If the universe operates on a fundamental, unchangeable law of hierarchy, then egalitarian ideologies that seek to dismantle all hierarchies, they are not just politically misguided. In Riker's framework, they are a literal cosmic error.
A cosmic error. So if Riker believes that forced equality is a cosmic error, how does he use that to analyze historical political movements? Does he view them as just politically wrong? Or fundamentally broken on a scientific level?
He views them as scientifically broken because they introduce entropy.
Entropy.
Right. Entropy, in physics, is a measure of randomness or disorder within a closed system. Riker argues that by trying to flatten human society and make everyone exactly equal in outcome, status, and role, cultural Marxists are essentially declaring war on the laws of physics. They are injecting entropy into a finely tuned system. And the universe, according to his reading of the CTMU, violently rejects entropy.
And he points to the French Revolution as a prime historical example of this entropy in action.
A perfect example for his point.
Yeah, the text outlines how the revolutionaries were driven by a burning desire for total equality.
Yeah.
They didn't just want minor political reform or tax changes. They wanted to wipe the slate completely clean. They wanted to destroy the monarchy, the church, the aristocracy, every natural hierarchy that existed.
Year zero, basically.
It's exactly. But Riker points out that instead of creating a utopian society of equals, they unleashed the reign of terror. Thousands of people were fed to the guillotine, and the country descended into violent anarchy. His takeaway is that by destroying the structure, they didn't get freedom. They just got blood and chaos.
And he applies the exact same analytical lens to the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks sought to completely destroy the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy to create a classless society. Riker argues that because this violates the cosmic syntax of natural hierarchy, it could never result in equality.
Right, because you can't cheat physics.
You can't. Instead, it resulted in a totalitarian dystopia defined by famine, poverty, and the massive gulag system. Riker uses these examples to cement a central thesis of the book-destroying structure does not breed equality, it breeds oppression. When you remove a natural, organic hierarchy, it is always swiftly replaced by a tyrannical, artificial one.
So if this push for absolute hierarchy-destroying equality has proven so consistently disastrous throughout history, the natural question for the listener is, where did the modern version of it come from?
How did we get here?
Right. Riker spends a significant portion of the book outlining a highly detailed history of the cultural Marxist playbook. He argues this wasn't just some accidental cultural drift or a natural evolution of progressive thought. He outlines a deliberate strategy that began in the 1930s with a group known as the Frankfurt School.
Yes, the Frankfurt School. They were a collective of Marxist intellectuals and sociologists figures like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse.
big names in critical theory.
The founders of it, essentially. They eventually fled Nazi Germany and established themselves within American academia. Riker focuses heavily on a key realization these thinkers had. They realized that traditional economic Marxism had completely failed to take root in the West.
Wait, let's pause there. Why did it fail? If we look at the history Riker provides, why didn't the working class in America revolt the way Karl Marx predicted they would?
Because capitalism, despite all its flaws, was actively raising the standard of living for the average person. The proletariat in America and Western Europe weren't revolting because they were acquiring cars, homes, and a level of prosperity that Marx hadn't anticipated at all.
They were too comfortable.
Exactly. The economic revolution failed because the workers were generally content with their lives.
So, according to Riker, because they couldn't unite the working class against the wealthy based on economics, they shifted their entire strategy to cultural subversion. If they couldn't divide society by class and money, they would divide it by identity and culture.
That was the pivot.
Right. Riker points out that their new targets became the foundational pillars of Western civilization: the traditional family, organized religion, and national identity. The thesis here is that if you want to bring down the capitalist West, you have to erode the cultural bedrock that holds it up.
And this is where Riker introduces Antonio Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony. Gramsci was an Italian Marxist thinker who, while sitting in a fascist prison, realized that violent revolution was just too difficult in stable Western democracies. The state apparatus was too strong.
You can't just storm the Capitol.
Right, you can't fight the army. Instead, he argued that the ruling class maintains its power not just through force, but through culture, the accepted norms of society. Therefore, the Marxist strategy must be a long march through the institutions.
And what does that long march actually look like in practice, according to the book?
Well, instead of trying to take over the government by force of arms, you slowly and methodically infiltrate the universities, the media, the arts, and the public education system. You change the culture from the inside out over generations.
It's a slow burn.
A very slow burn. You shift what is considered normal, moral, and acceptable until the society basically conquers itself.
Riker argues that this strategy worked flawlessly, which explains why so many modern institutions, particularly academia, seem heavily focused on deconstructing Western civilization today. He claims they aren't just reacting to current events, they're executing a playbook written almost a century ago.
A very deliberate playbook.
Right, and a massive weapon in that ideological playbook is postmodernism. Riker dives into French thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, who fundamentally assaulted the very concept of objective truth.
Yes. Postmodernism, as Riker defines it for his readers, argues that concepts like truth, morality, and even biological reality are not absolute facts. Instead, they're merely social constructs created by those in power to maintain their dominance over marginalized groups.
If you are listening, you see the downstream effects of this everywhere today. Riker points out how deeply this has infected modern language. It created a culture of extreme moral relativism.
Your truth, my truth.
Exactly. We constantly hear phrases today like "speak your truth" or "my truth," which completely replaces the idea of the objective truth. Riker argues that when you convince a population that there is no objective reality, that everything is just a subjective power struggle, you erode all trust in institutions, science, and history. You create a fractured society where literally anything goes.
It completely destabilizes the ground society walks on, and then Riker adds Herbert Marcuse back into the mix, specifically focusing on Marcuse's essay Repressive Tolerance.
That essay is mind-bending.
It really is. The text shows how the 1960s counterculture adopted Marcuse's highly influential logic. Marcuse argued that true tolerance actually requires suppressing right-wing or traditional views.
Which sounds like a total oxymoron. How does the book explain that logic?
It is the ultimate paradox. Marcuse argued that because traditional institutions are inherently oppressive, tolerating them is actually tolerating oppression.
I see. So if you tolerate them, you are the bad guy.
Exactly. Therefore, true liberation requires intolerance toward traditional, conservative, or religious viewpoints. This philosophy became the justification for everything we see today. From campus protests actively shutting down and deplatforming speakers, to modern corporate HR departments aggressively policing employee speech. It reframes censorship as a moral good.
Which brings us directly to the present day. Riker forcefully argues that this century-long history has culminated in a modern psychological war, largely fought on the battlefield of social media.
It's the new front line.
Yeah. He suggests that the algorithms of platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok are specifically engineered to exploit victimhood and enforce ideological conformity.
Yep.
In Riker's view, cancel culture isn't just about getting a specific person fired for a bad tweet.
No, it's way bigger than that.
It is a highly effective tool of psychological terror designed to tell the rest of the populace, stay in line, self-censor, or you will be destroyed next.
Furthermore, Riker highlights how this manifests in modern entertainment media. He notes that men are almost universally portrayed in one of two ways. Either as bumbling, incompetent sitcom fools who need their hyper-competent wives to save them from everyday tasks
We've all seen that trope.
constantly, or they are portrayed as hyper-stoic, emotionless, and ultimately toxic figures who need to be deconstructed by the narrative. He views this as a deliberate rewriting of the cultural narrative of masculinity, designed to sever young men from any positive historical role models.
So, with the diagnosis fully established, this overwhelming cultural, psychological, and spiritual assault on traditional masculinity, Riker pivots to the solution.
The battle plan.
Yes. And to do so, he looks backward to a very specific historical figure. He introduces the reader to the titular figure of the book, Saint Cedd.
Saint Cedd was a 7th century Anglo-Saxon monk and missionary.
Which seems like a random choice at first.
It does. At first glance, the reader might wonder what a medieval clergyman has to do with surviving modern social media algorithms. But Riker uses Cedd as a profound mirror for the modern man. Cedd was tasked with venturing into wild pagan territories in Britain to restore divine order and establish the Christian church.
And Riker draws a direct parallel here. He argues that ancient paganism, with its multitude of gods, its tribal conflicts, and its completely conflicting moral codes, promoted the exact same kind of moral relativism and spiritual chaos that modern cultural Marxism and postmodernism promote today.
Exactly. And Cedd didn't just wander around preaching abstract philosophical concepts to hostile crowds. He took physical, decisive action. He built lasting structures.
He built monasteries.
Yes, he founded monasteries, erected churches, and established disciplined communities. He created physical and spiritual fortresses of order amidst a literal landscape of chaos.
So what is the takeaway for the listener here? Riker is essentially telling modern men that they cannot just sit on the internet and complain about the culture war. You can't just tweet your way out of this. You must actively build structures, whether that is a family, a business, or a local community group, that align human society back with the divine natural hierarchy.
Because, as Riker heavily emphasizes in this section, this isn't merely a political disagreement over tax policy or social programs. He frames this as literal spiritual warfare.
Spiritual warfare.
Yes. He references C.S. Lewis's famous book, The Through Tape Letters, to illustrate this point. In Lewis's book, the narrative is told from the perspective of a senior demon teaching a junior demon how to corrupt a human soul.
And their primary tactic is inversion, right?
Yes, inversion. Riker argues that the cultural Marxist desire to invert the natural hierarchy, placing chaos above order, celebrating entropy, and dismantling the traditional family, is quite literally Satan's playbook. He views it not as a political ideology, but as a spiritual attack on the fundamental design of humanity.
And because the attack is so comprehensive and insidious, the defense must be equally robust and disciplined. Riker transitions from theory into very specific, actionable tactics for men to implement in their daily lives. The first tactic he lays out is an aggressive, uncompromising audit of your media consumption.
He calls this stopping the supply lines to the enemy.
I love that phrasing.
It's very militaristic. Riker is adamant that if you are consuming mainstream entertainment that glorifies victimhood, weakness, or moral degeneracy, you are actively funding and feeding the very system that seeks to marginalize you.
He advises men to ruthlessly cut that content out of their lives and replace it with material that reinforces strength, virtue, and traditional hierarchies. He is very specific with his recommendations, actually.
He gives a reading list, essentially.
Yeah. He suggests reading authors like Jordan Peterson, who heavily emphasize personal responsibility, watching commentators like Tucker Carlson, and utilizing alternative video platforms like Rumble, where he argues uncensored truth and traditional viewpoints are spoken more freely without fear of algorithmic suppression.
The second major actionable tactic is the absolute rejection of the victimhood mindset. Cultural Marxism, as Riker explains it, thrives by dividing people into rigid categories of oppressors and victims, encouraging individuals to blame systemic forces for their personal failure.
Always blaming the system.
Right. To combat this, Riker draws heavily on Viktor Frankl's seminal psychological work, Man's Search for Meaning.
Frankl was a psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor. He developed logotherapy based on his time in the concentration camps. Riker notes that Frankl observed that even in the absolute horrors of Auschwitz, stripped of every physical right and possession, a man always retains one final, irreducible freedom:
A freedom to choose.
the power to choose his internal response to his circumstances. Nobody can take that away.
And Riker uses Frankl's profound observation to challenge modern men. He insists that men must refuse the victim label entirely, regardless of whatever societal disadvantages, unfair algorithms, or cultural hostilities they face. He demands a stance of extreme psychological ownership.
The third tactic is a return to rigorous spiritual discipline. Riker isn't just using Saint Cedd as a neat historical metaphor. He advocates for actual daily spiritual practice. He spends time discussing the power of prayer, focusing specifically on the Lord's Prayer.
Breaking down the specific words.
Yeah. He argues that when a man prays the line, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done," he isn't just reciting empty religious words. Riker says you are actively, consciously aligning your own personal will with divine authority. You are willingly submitting to the cosmic hierarchy, which in turn gives you the strength to lead others,
He also heavily advocates for the physical practice of fasting.
which is very popular right now.
It is, but fasting isn't just about diet or biohacking for Riker. It is a tool to build ironclad discipline and maintain vigilance against the endless, cheap, dopamine-driven temptations of the modern consumer world. You have to master the body to master the mind.
And this emphasis on physical discipline leads directly into Riker's highly controversial views on the biology of masculinity. For Riker, the spiritual and the physical are completely inseparable. He makes a very bold claim in this chapter, moving away from philosophy and diving into endocrinology. He argues that testosterone is literally the biological currency of power.
He pulls absolutely no punches in this section. Riker flat out rejects the mainstream sociological consensus that masculinity is merely a social construct taught to young boys by a patriarchal society.
He thinks that's garbage.
Complete nonsense to him. He posits that masculinity is a biological, evolutionary imperative. Testosterone, he argues, is the specific chemical signature that drives men to build civilizations, to explore the unknown, to protect their tribes, and to conquer obstacles.
And he looks at historical societies that explicitly embrace this biological reality rather than trying to medicate it or suppress it. He points to the Spartans as a prime example. The Spartans didn't view male aggression and competitiveness as a pathology that needed to be cured.
No, they revered it.
They viewed it as a raw, vital national resource.
Exactly. Through their rigorous training system, the Agoj, they systematically channeled that raw, testosterone-fueled energy into intense physical discipline, martial skill, and unparalleled societal strength. They harnessed biology rather than fighting it.
He also looks at medieval Europe and the concept of knighthood. In that era, physical strength, martial prowess, and a strict code of honor literally determined the social order. It wasn't just an arbitrary class system. It was a direct reflection of biological reality that was absolutely necessary for the survival of the community in an incredibly harsh, violent world.
He brings up the Viking Age as well, the drive for male exploration, extreme risk-taking, and jumping into wooden longboats to conquer unknown lands across freezing oceans. Riker argues these were deeply ingrained biological inclinations driven by male endocrinology.
It's what men are wired to do.
Right. And while the men expanded the territory, the women kept the hearth, raised the next generation, and maintained the community structure.
Riker views this historical division of labor not as a system of patriarchal oppression, but as a highly efficient product of human evolution that allowed these specific societies to absolutely thrive and dominate their environments.
Which forces the reader to confront a critical question. What happens to a society when it actively denies this fundamental biology? Riker provides some incredibly grim modern statistics to illustrate the devastating cost of this denial.
Yeah, these numbers are hard to hear. He points out that men who spend over 2 hours a day on social media platforms that Riker notes actively police and punish traditional masculine expression are 30% more likely to suffer from chronic low self-esteem and depression.
Furthermore, he cites the tragic statistic that men are nearly 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women in the modern West.
4 times.
It's an epidemic. Riker attributes this devastating reality directly to a culture that demands men suppress their natural God-given instincts. His thesis is that when you tell a young man that his biological drive to lead, protect, and provide is inherently toxic, you strip him of his fundamental evolutionary purpose. The inevitable result of purposelessness is profound despair.
This naturally leads us into one of the most polarizing yet foundational themes of Riker's entire book, the role of women and the dynamics of gender. Riker is completely unapologetic in his stance here. He argues forcefully that men and women are fundamentally, biologically, and spiritually different, and that true societal harmony comes from complementarity, not strict, interchangeable equality.
He uses the specific phrase helpers, not competitors.
Right.
The text posits that women are biologically and spiritually wired to nurture, to support, and to bind the familial and social community together. Riker believes that when a society forces men and women to compete against each other in the exact same economic and social arenas, it introduces that entropic chaos we discussed earlier.
They end up fighting instead of building.
Exactly. But when the sexes embrace their distinct complementary roles, it creates a dualistic harmony that perfectly mirrors the structured order of the CTMU universe.
He points to the Victorian era as the ultimate historical blueprint for this dynamic, working successfully at scale. During the Victorian period, societal roles were rigidly defined by gender. Men were the undisputed providers and protectors who navigated the harsh, competitive public sphere of industry and politics. Women were the homemakers, the educators of children, and the undisputed moral centers of the private sphere.
And Riker's core argument is that this era wasn't some dark, oppressive age of misery, as it is often portrayed in modern academia. By respecting that divine complementary order, the Victorian era literally birthed the modern world.
It was an explosion of progress.
Unprecedented progress. It fueled the Industrial Revolution. It produced world-changing literary geniuses like Charles Dickens, engineering titans like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who built the modern railway network, and pioneers of modern healthcare like Florence Nightingale.
The argument is that this massive explosion of societal achievement, technological advancement, and cultural output is only possible when the foundational roles of men and women are secure, unquestioned, and working in tandem rather than in opposition.
What is particularly interesting about Riker's approach here is how he nuances this point about female roles using another historical figure, Saint Hilda of Whitby.
She was related to Cedd.
Yes, Hilda was actually Saint Cedd's sister, living in that same 7th century period. Now, Hilda was a powerhouse of a historical figure. She managed vast monastic estates, she educated entire communities, she hosted the famous Synod of Whitby, and she actively mentored future leaders, bishops, and kings. She wielded immense, undeniable influence and power.
But, and this is the critical distinction Riker makes for his readers, she did all of this under the broader framework of male ecclesiastical authority. She didn't seek to overthrow the hierarchy of the church. She operated brilliantly and faithfully within it.
She respected the syntax.
Exactly. Riker uses St. Hilda to prove that female strength, supreme intelligence, and capability can absolutely coexist harmoniously with submission to a broader male-led structure. In his view, acknowledging the hierarchy doesn't diminish women. It actually maximizes their impact for the benefit of the entire community without introducing entropy.
This leads perfectly into the final overarching theme of the book, which really ties all these historical and physical threads together, the concept of reclaiming dominion. Riker roots this idea deeply in Judeo-Christian theology, specifically pointing to Genesis 1.28, where God commands humanity to be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth.
But if you are listening, it is vital to understand how Riker defines dominion. He is very careful to clarify that dominion does not mean tyrannical exploitation. You aren't just pillaging the Earth's resources or dominating your family with an iron fist and a bad temper.
That's just tyranny.
Right. Riker compares the concept of dominion to being handed the keys to a finely tuned, incredibly expensive piece of machinery. You don't wreck it. You are a steward. You are fully responsible for maintaining it, improving it, fixing it when it breaks, and keeping it in perfect working order.
To help modern men achieve this kind of balanced dominion, Riker introduces a leadership model he calls the sword and the cross. It is his ultimate mandate for the modern man. He argues that you must perfectly balance physical strength, martial resolve, and boundaries, which he categorizes as the sword, with deep compassion, justice, self-sacrifice, and mercy, which he categorizes as the cross.
It's about dual capacity. Strength without compassion is just brutal tyranny. But compassion and empathy without the physical or moral strength to defend them is just impotence. It makes you a victim.
He provides several rich historical and cultural examples of men who mastered this balance. He points to King Solomon from the biblical text, who wielded absolute, unquestioned power over a massive kingdom, but was defined historically by his incredible wisdom, his fair judgments, and his sense of justice.
He also points to King Alfred the Great of England. Alfred used military brilliance and the literal sword to brutally and effectively defend England from the invading Viking hordes. But he perfectly balanced that martial violence with a deep, lifelong commitment to translating books, establishing laws, and promoting Christian mercy among his people.
A true philosopher king.
Yeah. Riker even pulls from modern pop culture to make this accessible, pointing to the character of Maximus from the movie Gladiator. Maximus is a man capable of immense, terrifying violence on the battlefield, but his core drive is entirely rooted in a deep love for his family, loyalty to his true emperor, and a desire for justice.
But the immediate question arises. How does a modern man who might be sitting in a cubicle, struggling with credit card debt and feeling completely overwhelmed by the culture war, actually achieve this epic sense of dominion?
Because we aren't Roman generals.
Right. Riker brings his massive philosophical argument all the way down to the microcosm of the individual life. He shares the anecdote of a man he calls John.
John's life, as described in the book, was an absolute mess. He had no career direction, he was experiencing constant marital strife, his finances were in ruin, and his health was failing. John felt completely paralyzed and overwhelmed by the macro problems of the world, the economy, politics, cultural shifts.
But Riker shows that John didn't try to go out and conquer a nation or defeat cultural Marxism by arguing with strangers on Twitter. That is a false sense of dominion.
It's a distraction.
Instead, John started incredibly small. He sat down and made a strict household budget. He established a daily, disciplined morning routine of waking up early and exercising. He started leading his family in simple, actionable ways, taking full responsibility for the emotional and spiritual energy in his own home.
By simply exercising dominion over his own immediate life, his own tiny, chaotic slice of the universe, John brought order to his personal microcosm. He stopped acting like a victim of the culture and became the Saint Cedd of his own living room.
And that, ultimately, is the concluding message of order and dominion. The macrocosm of society is merely a reflection of millions of individual microcosms. If you want to restore the divine hierarchy in the broader world and push back against cultural decay, you must first do the hard work of restoring it in your own mind, your own physical body, and your own home.
Let's take a breath and recap the sheer epic scope of what we have just covered in this deep dive. Conrad Riker's Order and Dominion is a massive, unapologetically sweeping blueprint. It takes the modern man's sense of alienation and explains it not just as a personal failing, but through the rigorous lens of history, the deliberate cultural Marxist capture of Western institutions, and even the fundamental quantum physics of the universe.
It connects all the dots.
It really does. It is explicitly designed as a battle plan for men who want to completely reject the modern victimhood narrative, actively embrace their biological imperatives, and confidently reclaim their traditional roles as the protectors, providers, and leaders of their communities.
It is undeniably a profound synthesis of highly disparate ideas. It challenges the reader to look completely beyond petty day-to-day politics and view the current cultural moment as a profound, historical, spiritual battle for order over entropic chaos.
Exactly. And if the ideas we unpacked in this deep dive resonated with you, or if you want to explore these arguments in their full, unabridged context, I strongly encourage you to go buy the ebook. You can find Order and Dominion right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Go get it.
And be sure to follow the author, Conrad Riker, over on Substack at Conrad Riker for more of his ongoing writings and essays. Also, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this deep dive with someone who needs to hear this breakdown.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. Something that isn't explicitly answered in Riker's text, but naturally flows from the intersection of his arguments and our current technological trajectory.
Okay, I'm ready.
If Christopher Langan's CTMU theory is correct, and hierarchy is indeed a self-correcting cosmic syntax woven into the very mathematical fabric of reality, what happens to us as our society increasingly hands the reins of institutional power over to artificial intelligence?
Wow.
Will these highly advanced algorithms, which are currently being programmed by a Silicon Valley culture that Riker argues is entirely captured by Marxist relativism, simply enforce and accelerate the societal chaos? Or will a truly hyperlogical AI, eventually analyzing the universe purely on raw data, physics, and outcomes, inevitably rediscover and mathematically enforce the very natural divine hierarchies that modern society has tried so desperately to erase?
Man, that is a chilling and absolutely fascinating thought experiment to end on. Does the machine enforce the man-made chaos, or does it inevitably discover God's hierarchy embedded in the math? We will leave you to ponder that. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly thorough deep dive. We will see you next time.